Okay, hello, my name is Jeff Harris. This is Training in Unified Psychotherapy Level 1, Part 3. So we're going to be talking about experiential focus in unified psychotherapy. So the last week we talked about there are going to be times when we're going to be focusing on cognition more than other dimensions and using it as a lever for change. Today, we're going to be talking about focusing on experience and emotion. So some of the experiential themes in psychotherapy are phenomenology, maladaptive emotions, emotion regulation, experiential avoidance, self-actualization, authenticity, awareness and experimentation, motivation, authentic happiness, creativity, spirituality, and transpersonal psychology. So you can see that is a pretty broad, swath. That's a pretty lot of territory. So we're going to be focusing on emotions and phenomenology the most, but you can see some of these themes like self-actualization and authenticity go back 50, 60, 70 years to the heyday of humanistic psychotherapy. Some of these are more recent emphases in psychotherapy. So we've got a lot of territory to cover, but we're going to be focusing mostly on phenomenology and using emotions as a way to enter phenomenology. So the historical context is that humanistic and existential approaches arose in the middle of the 20th century. The most prominent humanistic psychotherapies were Rogers' person-centered therapy and Pearl's Gestalt therapy, and early existential psychotherapy was Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. And what humanistic and existential approaches shared was a phenomenological perspective that viewed the client as the expert on their own experience. So before I define phenomenology in a technical way, I'm going to do a little experiment, and Rachel's going to help me. So Rachel, have you ever seen the sunrise?
Yes.
Okay, tell me about the sun rising.
Well, I'm usually very tired the few times that I've seen it. It happens slowly and there's changing colors and it gets brighter.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did the sun rise over the earth?
Yes.
Okay. So who wants to tell Rachel how she's right and how she's wrong about that? So this goes, back to the history of astronomy. So what is the earth stable, and did the sun rise around the earth, or did the sun stay stable relative to the earth and the earth slowly rotated toward the sun? Which of those?
Oh, right. The latter.
Okay. So the sunrise is my example of phenomenology. So I want to, from a phenomenological perspective, you are correct. You were standing on a large enough object that it appeared that the sun was rising. However, from an I don't say that word very often, an astronomical perspective, the sun is a large object a long way away, and you are on a large sphere that rotates. So for me, the sunrise is an example of phenomenology. So it is, when I'm working with my clients, it would be impolite to say, hey, the sun didn't rise, the earth rotated. I'm putting myself in their perspective and trying to embrace phenomenology. So thank you, Rachel, for participating in this experiment.
My pleasure.
So here's how Ellen Greenberg defined a phenomenological perspective. Clients are viewed as having privileged access to their unique experiences. Client processes of discovery and choice are therefore emphasized over the taking of an interpretive or an advisory focus. So when I interpret or advise, I'm playing the expert role and not grounding myself just in their experience. So a client-centered phenomenological viewpoint is in contrast to a medical model in psychoanalysis, where the analyst is the expert, and focusing on the client's experience is also a contrast to the mechanistic view of human nature espoused by behaviorism. So the more mechanistic view would be you didn't see the sunrise, the earth rotated toward the sun. And so this, 2 weeks ago, we talked about how in the middle of the 20th century, psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and humanism were the three main forces that were competing, and phenomenology is something that humanistic and existential approaches shared that contrasted them from psychoanalysis and behaviorism. So here's a quote from Carl Rogers on experience. Experience is for me the highest authority. The touchstone of validity is my own experience. No other person's ideas, and none of my own ideas, are as authoritative as my experience. It is to experience that I must return again and again to discover a closer approximation to truth as it is in the process of becoming in me. So we're going to be talking about experience as one of the areas of focus for of psychotherapy this week. But we're also going to be talking about emotions as a way to understand experience. So emotion-focused therapy is a contemporary integration of Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy and Fritz Perls' Gestalt therapy. And Leslie Greenberg is the one who's been written the most about this, but he's co-authored lots of books with other authors. So EFT takes the idea of following and using empathy from person-centered therapy. EFT draws upon ideas from Gestalt for leading the client and evoking emotional responses. So I want you to think about this for a few minutes. So Greenberg suggested that there's times when we should use empathy and follow our clients, and you spend our energy in a non-directive way, understanding our clients from their perspective. But there are other times where the client's awareness is only partial, and during those situations, we can push them a little further and poke around a little bit more and lead them and evoke more emotions. And that's what Gestalt did. So I want you to think about that in your own work. When should you let the client take the lead? And when should you take the lead? And so, I wish we had more time to discuss this, but I want you to think about that in terms of being phenomenological. There are times when we want that the client can go where they need to go, and there's other times where we may need to lead them a little further and evoke experiences that they might not otherwise explore. So emotion-focused therapy was originally called process experiential psychotherapy. They took a couple tries to figure a good word, but I think that in our context here, thinking about emotion being parallel to cognition and behavior is really helpful to think about this as emotion, but it's also a little broader. So I'm going to be using the term experiential psychotherapy and thinking of emotion-focused therapy as one version of experiential psychotherapy, but the most prominent and the most well-researched. So when we focus on emotion, emotion is seen by many experiential psychotherapists as closer to a person's phenomenological experience than thoughts or actions. So in this way, we're going to be using emotion as an entry point into phenomenological experience. And as we said a couple of weeks ago, emotions are always interacting with cognition and behavior. And as we'll be talking about later in the summer, emotional experience is shaped by both external influences like interpersonal patterns and family systems and cultural context, and internal influences like biology and unconscious processes. So we're going to be using emotion as an entry point into phenomenological experience. Any questions on that idea? And you can do that verbally or in the chat box. Okay. I can't see the chat box when I'm sharing the screen, so that's why I had to flip back there. Okay, so here are some markers for focusing on feelings. So lots of clients have unexpressed emotions that they're not, that they haven't explored and might need our help in exploring. Hold on, I'm just trying to, okay. I'm sorry. Clients may have unrealized goals or dreams. They may not have a lot of personal awareness about their own experience. They may not have a conflicted sense of self, and they may have existential issues that need to be explored. So these are markers for focusing on feelings. So we talked 2 weeks ago about using a multidimensional survey. We'll be talking about that in another 2 weeks, about exploring dysfunctional thoughts, emotions, and actions, and then working with clients to identify a focal dimension for exploration and change. When we use experiential interventions, the primary impact is to encourage adaptive emotions, but because thoughts, feelings, and actions are always interacting, when we encourage adaptive emotions, the secondary impact will be functional thoughts and effective actions. So wherever everything's connected, so wherever we intervene is going to have an impact on the other parts of the system. So I want you to think about how often you use emotions as a focal dimension for exploration and change. And I'm like we did last week for cognition, I'm going to have you type into the chat whether you focus on emotions almost every session with almost every client, with most clients, but not every session, with some clients, but not most, and rarely or never. So go ahead and answer that survey question in the chat box. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can read some responses. Almost every session with almost every client, almost every session with most clients, but not every session, almost every session, most clients, most sessions. With most, but not all. Okay, so most of them had, most of you answered with the first two answer, with almost every session, with almost every client, and with most clients, but not every session. And again, there's a worksheet that you can fill out. So hopefully most of you received the worksheet. I'm just going to be sending these through the TUP dates and not double sending. So if you're not receiving the PowerPoint slides or the worksheets, please email me and I'll try and make sure that you're on the TUP date, which is a Google group. And I want you to think about for yourself, what psychotherapy interventions do you use most frequently to encourage adaptive emotions? And we'll be talking about a number, I'll be introducing a little bit about the way I work with emotions. We're going to be thinking about some other ones. So we will return to this question later in this webinar. So I've mentioned Barbara Ingram's book on clinical case formulation. In her book, she mentions that sometimes the problem requires an emotional focus to help the client improve awareness, acceptance, understanding, expression, and regulation of feelings. So there are emotions we can focus on them. When we focus on emotions, we can do lots of different things. We can help clients become more aware of their emotions. We'll talk a little bit later about accepting painful emotions that may be adaptive. We'll talk about understanding the value of emotions. We'll be encouraging clients to express emotions. And then we'll be talking about how to regulate emotions, when sometimes our emotions are too intense or whether they're not strong enough. So all of these are different ways that we can work with emotions in psychotherapy. And if we do decide in the fall to do some longer some more in-depth training on experiential psychotherapy, we will be looking at these as separate ways of intervening and separate ways of working with clients. So we want to start with the question, why do humans have emotions? Does anyone want to try and answer that question? Anybody want to turn on their microphone and tell me why humans have emotions?
For surviving.
For surviving. Okay. And Merve, how do emotions help us survive?
Protect us from danger.
Okay. Okay. So that is Merve is right, or I agree with Merve. That's a little bit more in my phenomenological perspective. Merve is right because she agrees with me. So this is a definition from Leslie Greenberg, who's written more about emotions in psychotherapy than anybody else in the last 40 years. So emotions are designed to help humans direct their attention to what is important. So emotions say, this, should I pay attention over here or over here, is going to direct to your attention to what's important. Emotions are designed to synthesize complex experiences to their most essential aspects. So emotions take complex information and boil it down to something more essential. Emotions help motivate people for action. So most emotions have an action potential. And in summary, which is what Merve highlighted, was that emotions help humans adapt to their environment. So that theme of adaptation, Merve used the word survival. So emotions help humans adapt and survive. And so we'll be using that theme of adaptation. And adaptation is a theme that is used across different integrative psychotherapy. So adaptation is an integrative theme. So we got a couple. I have to stop sharing the PowerPoint to look at the chat box. So okay, so humans have emotions because they have drives, and we talked, so action potentials and drives are similar. Humans predict dangerous situations. So we'll be talking about, so Jake, I'm going to ask you to turn on your mic and tell me what emotions helps predict dangerous situations. That is the purpose of one of the emotions, but not all of them. So Jake, do you want to turn on your mic and tell me what emotion is helping us deal with danger?
Thinking fear and anxiety.
Yeah, so fear is, and we'll talk about, we have a slide for this in a minute. So you're right on here that fear is helps us alert us to danger. Thanks, Jake. To signal what is important. It's lightning fast processing for adapting because to make life worth living. So there's that qualitative perspective that emotions make life richer. There's a bonding aspect, and there's a communication aspect, and fear helps us adapt to danger. So all of again, from my phenomenological perspective, you're all right, but from an objective perspective, you agree with me and the way I've been trained by reading books by people like Leslie Greenberg. Okay, while I'm over here, I'm gonna turn on, okay, I think everyone's allowed to talk. I feel when I press the allowed to talk button, I feel like an elementary school teacher. You're allowed to talk now. So everyone's allowed to talk in my classroom. And then Gail said, love promotes propagation of our species. Yes. So all of these emotions have different, oh, I pressed the wrong button. I thought I lost everyone. Let me go back to the share screen.
I think you're good.
Okay, you can still see the screen. Okay. Okay. So let's be more specific. So in emotion focused therapy, they talk about the distinction between primary, secondary, and instrumental emotions. And we're going to start on the bottom of this picture. So primary emotions are the core of experience, but may not be recognized or displayed outwardly. Primary emotions may be adaptive or maladaptive. So the assumption here is that we have a core emotion, but it's not always the one that we focus on or express. So sometimes we have a secondary emotion that is a reaction to a primary emotion or to a thought. So an example for me is, as an American male, I have been socialized not to express fear. Don't be a scaredy cat. Goes all the way back to elementary school or probably preschool. Don't be a scaredy cat. So often when I feel fear, I cover it up, and often I will react with a secondary emotion, and in many times anger. So it was more, as an American male, it was more acceptable for me to express anger than fear. So sometimes I react to a primary emotion like fear with a secondary emotion like anger. And then so secondary emotions are a reaction to a primary emotion or to a thought. And then at the top level, instrumental emotions are displayed to serve a social purpose. So sometimes it is not helpful for us to display what's really going on, and so we want to display something else. So I remember when I was not a very good baseball player when I played Little League, and the way I coped with my failure was to say, this is a dumb game, but I didn't want to tell the other players on my team that this was a dumb game, and so I would display shame and embarrassment at my failure. And so I would kick up the dust, and I was instrumentally displaying discouragement or shame in order not to be made fun of by my team, but to get emotional support. So I want you to, these are some ideas that we'll talk about later, and if we have time to practice the conceptualization, but I want you to think about these for yourself and for your clients. When do you display the primary emotion, and when do you display or express or experience a secondary emotion, or when do you display or express or experience an instrumental emotion? So now we'll go back to this theme of adaptation. Emotions have evolved to help people adapt to the environments they encounter. This is the way Elliott, Watson, Goldman, and Greenberg describe it. The normal function of emotion is to rapidly process complex situational information to prepare the person to take effective action. So there's that rapid processing. It's taking a complex situation down to its core and then preparing for action. So here is, we're going back to the idea here is that each emotion has a different purpose. So again, I can't see the chat, so you're gonna have to turn on your microphone. So we already covered this one. So I'm gonna have, I don't remember who said this correctly 5 minutes ago. So fear is an adaptive response to
Danger.
danger. That's correct. Okay. Fear is an adaptive response to danger. Anger is an adaptive response to
violation of limits.
Violation of limits. Good. Thank you, Leah. So anger is an adaptive response to violation. Sadness is an adaptive response to
Object loss.
loss. So yes, sadness is an adaptive response to loss. Guilt is an adaptive response to
mistakes or damages.
Yeah, mistakes or damages. So guilt is an adaptive response to doing something wrong. When I do something wrong, I should feel some guilt. And pride is an adaptive response to
doing something right.
Yeah, so doing something right. So each of these emotions can serve an adaptive purpose, but not every time we feel any of the emotions is it adaptive. Sometimes there are maladaptive responses. So sometimes fear is maladaptive when you're not in danger. Has anyone here ever been scared of something that wasn't dangerous?
Of course.
Yeah, it was a rhetorical question. Fair Devs, do you want to share an example?
Like, for example, I'm usually afraid of like animals, any kind of animals or insects. I know like some of them are really not dangerous, but I'm afraid of them.
Right. And some animals and insects are dangerous. So your fear is overgeneralized. So there are animals that are dangerous and animals are not. There are insects that are dangerous and insects that are not. Anger is not helpful when you have not been violated. Has anyone ever been angry when they were really hurt? And again, most of these are rhetorical questions. So I'm going to say that road rage is a maladaptive emotional response where you should be afraid if someone is in the lane ahead of you and doesn't see, and you're in their blind spot and they change lanes and nearly miss your car. Fear, you should be afraid, but often we respond to danger. So anger may be a maladaptive response. Sadness is maladaptive when there hasn't been a loss. Guilt and shame may be harmful when you have not done anything wrong. Pride may be maladaptive when you haven't done something well. So if you cheat on a test and get away with it, if you embezzle money from your company and get away with it, you might be proud of that, but that's probably maladaptive pride. And any of these emotions can be maladaptive when they're disproportional to the situation. So if there's a slight violation, but you're angry for a week, that might be disproportional to the situation. If something's a little bit dangerous, but you feel very afraid, that might be disproportional to the situation. Any questions or comments about maladaptive, these adaptive emotional responses or maladaptive emotional responses? And this is a little tricky because without this, many of you may have been trained to say to your clients, all of your emotions are helpful. And I think I struggle with this language, so I want you to be thinking a little bit about how to say. I often say this is a really normal response. Lots of people feel this way, but it may not be the most helpful way to respond. So when I talk about shame, I'm a college student. I had a couple students this semester who flunked classes, who failed classes, and felt some shame. And so it is normal to feel shame about failure, but it may be more helpful to feel sad. And that's the tricky work that we need to do, is to help our clients to pay attention to their emotions, explore them and experience them. But then we are going emotion-focused therapy encourages us to go just a little bit further to help clients realize which of their emotions are helpful and which of them may not be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it also true that there's like a cultural context when I guess I'm thinking adaptive for whom or when?
Yes. Yeah, and so that's a great point, that that culture and emotions interact. And so what's helpful in one cultural context, an emotional response that may be normative or helpful in one cultural context may not be helpful in another one. So somehow I figured out, I pressed some different buttons and I can now read the chat and while I'm sharing the screen. So let me read a couple of those. Jim, did you want to say something else about the cultural part?
Well, I mean, the most obvious one that popped out at me is like if you have a lot of power, then being angry may not be maladaptive, right? It may get people to fear you and do your bidding, and it's narcissistic and evil, but it might be adaptive in some weird way, right? And of course,
Right. Right, yeah, so I think that's a good point, that if you have power, being angry might get you more attention, but if you aren't, it may get you punished. So let me, yeah, so Pei-Tao said what's considered adaptive and maladaptive may be regulated by social and cultural norms, and I agree. I think that's what Jim was just talking about. So for example, every culture encourages people to feel shame about some behaviors, but culture's different about what we should feel ashamed about. Okay, Rachel said, I think that's the key with my patients. Use the emotion is accurate or valid, but it's the intensity that's too high. Yeah, and Rachel, we're not going to touch on this today as very much, but if we do a longer version of experiential psychotherapy, I have kind of the curvilinear relationship between stress and performance. I think that works for each of these emotions, that you can have too little fear, the right amount of fear, or too much fear, and the same thing with grief, with sadness or anger or whatever. So I think that's something else that I'd like for us to, we might have time to explore later in the fall. Thomas says, I'm thinking about secondary gains. For example, anger can be useful for purposes other than boundaries. Yeah, and I think that might be instrumental anger, Thomas, that if you express anger, I'm going to get a little better service. And Karunakar says that in some cultures, aggression is encouraged. Definitely. Some cultures value aggression and anger more than others. Okay, those are great comments. So let's go back to the slides and okay. EFT suggests that emotions are vital in the construction of self. The adaptive value of emotions lies in their ability to alert an individual of both potential negative and positive outcomes. And so maladaptive emotions often involve overlearned responses from previous experiences that begin to negatively affect an individual's ability to function in their current environment. So Greenberg suggests that the four most common maladaptive emotions that we see in psychotherapy are unresolved grief. So people that are feeling sad and stuck and bereaved and are stuck in that process. You know, I often describe there's a normal recovery curve after loss, but sometimes we get stuck and we don't recover. Fear of day-to-day stressors, so fear of things that are not particularly dangerous, or disproportional fear, being too afraid of confrontation, being too afraid of expressing yourself. A third pattern is overwhelming guilt and shame. So feeling guilty or ashamed when we haven't done anything wrong, or disproportional guilt and shame to doing small mistakes and feeling a great deal of guilt or shame. And then anger itself for others. So each of these different emotions, whether it's grief or fear or guilt and shame or anger, can be maladaptive in different times. And that's what it's our role as psychotherapists to try and explore some of these and help encourage adaptive emotions and help people move past or let go of maladaptive emotions. Okay, so this is back to our, any questions about adaptive and maladaptive emotions? So again, this is part of our simple foundation. 2 weeks ago, we talked about complexity and simplicity. And so there's where we're gonna, we talked about cognition, emotion, or behavior can be adaptive or maladaptive. And this week we're talking about that center column. So this brings us to our weekly visit from Glinda the Good Witch. Glinda, at the beginning of The Wizard of Oz, asked Dorothy if she was a good witch or bad witch. So in our oversimplified way, we are going to ask our clients, is this a good feeling or a bad feeling? So adaptive emotions match the situation in a proportional manner, help synthesize and evaluate situations, and organize people for effective actions. In contrast, maladaptive emotions do not match the situation, are disproportional responses, result in inaccurate evaluation, or interfere with effective action. So when we're intervening, we can explore or transform. And so last week we talked a little bit about exploring and transforming cognitions. So this week we're going to be talking about exploring and transforming emotions. We suggested that there are some general parallel strategies for the exploration phase and the transformation phase. And so today we're going to be exploring emotions first. And so I'm going to show you a demo in a minute, and I'm going to be trying to pull on 4 of these strategies to explore emotions, focusing on feelings related to clients presenting concerns, understanding the context and function of specific feelings, analyzing feelings to determine if they're adaptive or maladaptive, and then discovering unexplored emotional experiences that may be outside of awareness. So those are 4 things that we can do to explore emotions, and they are parallel to the 4 strategies that we looked at last week for exploring cognition. So this is designed to be easier to learn because we're doing similar things for cognition, emotion, and behavior. So we're gonna, in a minute, you're gonna see me working with Anxious Eileen, who is a role play client. And Celio has a question, but I'll get that in a minute. So Anxious Eileen is a character played by our student Stephanie, who's on here with us. And when we checked in with her 2 weeks ago with a multidimensional survey, we looked at her thoughts, actions, and feelings. The feelings that she highlighted were fear of failure, fear of rejection, and disappointment in self. So I'm going to be showing you a video of my work with Eileen, and I want you to kind of watch out for my use of these 4 strategies: focusing on feelings, understanding context and function, analyzing feelings to determine if they're adaptive, and discovering unexplored emotional experiences. Okay, can you see that video now? So
Yes.
I want to look a little more closely at some of your emotions. So the other day when we talked about the emotions that were associated with your anxiety and panic attacks, we talked about fear of failure, fear of rejection, and disappointment in self. And as we're trying to understand the emotions related to your anxiety, which of those should we look at a little bit more deeply?
Fear of failure.
Fear of failure? Okay, and that was the one the other day that you said that was the prime mover, or the one most associated with anxiety. So when we think about your fear of failure, I'm wondering when that comes up the most.
Primarily around school.
Okay, and so when you are afraid of failing in school, how does that impact your thoughts? When you're feeling scared, what thoughts does that generate?
That I'll never be able to do this. Or again, like, people are gonna know I'm not gonna be able to do this.
Okay, so I'll never be able to do that, and people will know. So like some of the thoughts, there's an internal version and an external version. And then when you feel afraid, how does that impact your actions? How does it impact your actions?
Usually I feel just like overwhelmed, I guess.
So it's interesting with fear that often a little bit helps performance but a lot often interferes. So the metaphor I use is like an athlete before a basketball game. If you go, oh, it's not a big game, who cares? We can beat that team. Then you may not be trying your hardest, and a moderate amount of stress or fear might really push you, but too much might freeze you up or interfere. And the same thing with a test or a paper or whatever. So do you think that the fear helps you or hurts you perform as a student?
Using the metaphor, I think it hurts me when I feel overwhelmed because then I just don't want to do anything.
And when you feel overwhelmed with fear, do you feel like you're running away or freezing or shutting down? Does one of those fit better to describe? So shutting down is just blocking it out. Running away is, with a fearful thing like a dangerous animal, sometimes you might freeze so he doesn't see you, and sometimes you might run away. So does it feel like what does the fear feel like it's doing for you?
I think the shutting down piece.
So tell me what that looks like, what shutting down looks like for you.
So I'll do other things. I'll purposely try not to think about school, kind of give up.
So you're avoiding and giving up.
Yeah.
So it's not the moderate amount of fear that keeps you sharper. It's the overwhelmed where you just kind of check out and give up and avoid that.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you think about this day-to-day fear with school and thinking about a test or thinking about a paper or thinking about a lab, are there deeper feelings that you think might generate these day-to-day fears?
I guess I think, sometimes I'm afraid that if I fail school, that I'm afraid that I won't ever be anyone.
So if you fail in school, you're afraid you won't be anyone.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me more about what does that mean to be afraid that you won't be anyone?
Like I won't have anything to show my worth to people.
Okay, so if I fail, I won't be able to show my worth. So you're afraid that if you fail in school, it means you're not worthy at a deeper level.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's the day-to-day fear of, will I do well on this test? Will I pass this lab? But a deeper fear of, if I don't succeed in this endeavor, I won't be able to show my worth.
Yeah.
Okay, let's stop there. Okay, can you all see are we back to the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so during this demonstration, I was trying to focus on feelings, understand context and function, analyzing the feelings to determine if they're adaptive, and discovering unexplored emotional experiences. Any reactions or comments or questions about this demonstration? Again, it's a demonstration. Stephanie, in portraying Eileen, helped it take 5 minutes rather than 10 or 15. So there's a representative, but not completely accurate. Any questions or comments about the demonstration of exploring emotions?
So Jeff, this is Ed. While you were
doing this, while we were watching this demo, I couldn't help but think that our recent training in EFT by Rhonda Goldman, she would probably freak out about this because it's not, it's EFT, it's very informed by EFT, but it's a lot more standardized and directive. Because EFT strikes me as being, in some respects, a bit more person-centered in some respects. You know, it's more directive, but it still kind of falls on that. With the way you're describing it, seems to me to be more CBT and standardized in terms of what you're doing.
So this is, Ed, I appreciate that feedback. Years ago, my when my EFT was or experiential psychotherapy was my primary orientation, some of my colleagues accused me of being CBT because I was being structured. So my argument is that you can be structured in your exploration of emotions, and that doesn't mean that you're cognitive or behavioral.
No, I'm just using that more as an example. I actually like this because I think that the non-directive nature of EFT would put some people off. Whereas I think having it more standardized in terms of what you're doing definitely would be more applicable for more people.
Yeah, so this is more structured than Rhonda Goldman would do, or Leslie Greenberg, and they're focused more on evoking. So this is a little bit more structured, Ed, and a little bit more transparent. It is more transparent that I'm looking at what's adaptive and what's maladaptive. And so the question that I'm curious about people reacting to is me asking the question, does the fear help you or hurt you? And yeah, so some people would think that that's a good question and some people not. And I had an intern I was supervising a couple of years ago who very clearly wanted to explore emotions, and that's all, and didn't want to make any judgments, didn't, just wanted to explore emotions. And I said, well, I think it's important to feel if they're helpful. So what do people think of my question? Does the fear help you or hurt you? Is that a helpful question to get at this idea of adaptive or maladaptive emotions?
I think it was helpful. I use that all the time in my sessions. And I think that's kind of like the first step to help the clients be aware of what they're actually doing and what they're actually feeling in a way. So, because after that, the third step, analyzing feelings, they usually get like, they usually decide like, oh, okay, I should do this, or I shouldn't do this, or like, maybe I need to find another way, or maybe there's a problem, like I'm stuck in here or something. So I find it very helpful.
Thank you. So I'm going to read a couple of the questions or comments in the chat box. Jake said, it seems to still have a cognitive bent, focusing on the thoughts connected to feelings. Yeah, we are definitely here, Jake. We are thinking about feelings. And even in the next video where we're transforming, this week I've been questioning the use of transforming, and I'll tell you afterwards the other thing that I'm doing. So there is a time when so from an emotion-focused therapy, people definitely want to evoke the emotions and to activate the emotions. So, and sometimes I'm doing that and sometimes not. In this video, it was more thinking about the feelings rather than feeling them. Jim said, I like the probing for deeper feelings below the surface. And I think that this usually doesn't take 5 minutes in a demo. So this is a little artificial for the purposes of this demonstration, but I do think over time you do want to look at deeper emotions. Rachel said you asked about general thoughts, feelings rather than a specific eliciting situation. Was that intentional? Do you tend to do both? Sometimes I do either one, Rachel, and I don't. And when when I'm doing that with a client, I try and I pause for a moment and say, why am I doing a specific example now? Why am I doing that? Often I do, when I do a multidimensional survey, I often say, let's describe the general process, and then I have them reflect during the week to look at specific examples. So I definitely think it's good to describe the general pattern, and then on subsequent weeks to see if it followed the general pattern or was a little different. Amy said it feels like emotional guided discovery. Absolutely. And if you want, Amy, if you want to help me clarify that over time, I think that that's a good way to describe it. And I'm intrigued by that. So I may not remember that, but let's
absolutely. I can help you remember.
Thank you, Amy. I'm gonna tag you on that. Karunakar said, is it not required to inquire into past traumatic experiences? Definitely. So this is a tricky thing for the training model, that in this training model, I'm training you this week to talk about feelings, and next week behaviors, and last week cognition. But in practice, you're going to look at these interactions more synthetically, more organically, more interactively. So in level 2, we'll be talking about looking at development across life experiences, how that impacts the anxiety. So we definitely do that, and it's going to be more interactive in real life than in this training model where we're doing the different parts. So we will, in 2 weeks, be talking about how to work it together, and to work both interactively with cognition, emotion, behavior, and contextually with external and internal influences. And then we'll look at, in level 2, we'll look at several external and internal influences. And then the very final session, which I think is on September 3rd, we'll be talking about interactively together. So yeah, we are artificially dividing this for training purposes, but working will be more interactive. Thomas says it catches the situation for some patients and not for other patients. How about investigation of critical events? Certainly, I use that often with guilt, healthy guilt and unversity guilt, and feeling stuck. Yeah, I think that's a good one. For guilt, I often talk about remorse and regret as healthy versions. I can regret doing something that hurt someone. I can be remorseful, but shame is not often helpful. Elizabeth said, emotions serve functions for clients. Many of my clients would initially say that their anxiety helps them to avoid the feared outcome. And I think that that's the proportional response part. I ask, in what ways does it help? In what ways does it hinder? I think that's a great question. And that was probably a better question than the way I asked it. Ed says, how well does this approach work if someone isn't very experiential? And that's absolutely true. So some people are going to answer these questions right away. I work with college students. We have a big engineering school. Obviously, many of the engineers have been trained to use their intellect more than their emotions. And this reminds me of what Arnold Lazarus called bridging, that you start where they're strong and then you gradually go to the other one. So these are all really good questions. So I think we're capturing the good questions and looking at the strengths and limitations of this. And this is just a starting point. And again, the demo is a little artificial. So this is just a summary of the work I did with Eileen. From Eileen's perspective, her fear of failure comes out in the context of school. It generates thoughts like, I'll never be able to do this. And she shuts down, the action is shuts down, and there's an underlying deeper fear that she won't be anyone and she won't be able to show her worth. So let's shift again to the idea of transforming. 10 years ago, when I was working on these parallel strategies, these key strategies training, the word change didn't work as well for emotions as for cognition and behavior. You can change your thoughts, you can change your actions. Sometimes the EFT folks talk about transforming emotions. In many cases, and this is true for the demo you're about to watch, there wasn't really a transformation. It's more a discovery of more adaptive emotions. So I'm thinking about changing this to discovery, and you can let me know if you think that's a better process. I did this, and I'll tell you after we look at Eileen, I may tell you about a client I worked with this week that we were doing this pivot. So for this transforming emotions, there's some active experimenting with new feelings and helping clients overcome their emotional blocks. So we're poking around, and I think I used the word poking around with Eileen, that we're poking around to see if there may be new feelings or to let feelings out that may be blocked. We're trying to generate adaptive feelings. We're trying to reflect on those and consolidate meaning or put them into practice. If you felt sad instead of ashamed, what would that look like this week? So putting them into practice, and then seeing their impact, seeing if we're able to change emotions and seeing if it has an impact on thoughts and actions. So in the demo, I'll be focusing more on the first two, and even, yeah. So again, let's look at this demonstration. Jeff will encourage Eileen to experiment with new ways of feeling that may be more adaptive and less likely to result in anxiety and panic. So let's take a look at that. So Eileen, I want to look at this fear of failure and kind of poke around and see if we can find a more helpful emotion. Since we know that the fear of failure kind of shuts you down, we want to see if there's a better way to react emotionally. So first, I want to know whether this fear is realistic or not. So have you failed as a student in nursing?
Yeah, I failed my qualifying exam.
Okay. I'm sorry to hear that. What was that like for you when you failed the qualifying exam?
Well, very, very distressing, especially since I stayed up the night before working hard.
How late did you stay up? Do you remember?
I think I finally went to bed around like 4.
Okay, so you only got a few hours of sleep.
Yeah.
And do you think that impacted did that impact your performance on the qualifying exam?
Yeah, probably.
So this is an example of being afraid and saying, I'm afraid I don't know enough. I need to study for another hour. I need to study for another hour and study for another hour. But then that pattern of staying up late and only getting a few hours of sleep interfered with your performance.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we think about the fear of failure and, particularly with the qualifying exam as an example, are there other emotions that maybe we're going on to think about it, to see if some of the other reactions might be more helpful than the fear that shuts you down? So when you failed the qualifying exam, were you angry at yourself? Were you sad or disappointed? Were you angry at the nursing board? Were there other feelings that were present at that time?
I think I was definitely like disappointed. That's the one that stands out to me the most.
So tell me about the disappointment. And so disappointment is a form of sadness. So that's it makes sense that you would be sad and disappointed after a failure. Tell me about the disappointment and how that's different than the fear.
Well, I think when I'm disappointed, I kind of think, well, I can just try again.
So when you were disappointed, instead of it shutting you down or keeping you up late, somehow when you were disappointed, the next response is, I can just try again.
Yeah, and maybe succeed that time.
And maybe succeed. So I hear another feeling emerging with the disappointment. I can just try again and maybe I'll succeed. So what's that when you say maybe I'll succeed? What's that other feeling?
Maybe feeling like hopeful.
Yeah, I heard just a little bit of hope, and so somehow fear, kind of shuts you down or keeps you up too late, but somehow disappointment has a recovery curve. If I'm disappointed that I did well, but I can try again and maybe I'll succeed. And then there's a sense of hope.
Yeah.
So that's good to pay attention that the sadness, the disappointment has a way out.
Yeah.
The fear kind of crashes you, but somehow for you internally, emotionally, that there's sadness, the disappointment leads to I can try again and maybe I'll succeed, and there's a sense of hope. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then so what's interesting is fear is not in this case, fear has not been helpful, because sometimes it shuts you down and sometimes it makes you make choices like, I can pass my test on 3 hours of sleep, but disappointment helps you try again and helps you feel a little hope of success in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think as we look at these thoughts and feelings about failure and about self-worth, I think the next spot will be, it'll be helpful to look at actions that are associated with these more functional ways of thinking and these more adaptive ways of feeling.
Okay.
So that'll be the next step. Okay, welcome back. So same questions. Any reactions to this demonstration where I'm working with Eileen, and we've identified the fear as somewhat maladaptive, and we are poking around, we are trying to discover other feelings that might be helpful. So Maria said, depend on the setting, we can use more interactive techniques, more in real life interventions. I worked many years in residential therapeutic programs. We had the opportunity of interventions while things were happening, not just talking about it. Right, so in group therapy particularly, or in a residential program where there's that therapeutic milieu, we have live data. So that's definitely interesting. Karunakar said, very interesting way of emotions, and Celio, I'm getting the little clap emoji. So anybody else want to comment upon this kind of actively poking around and asking people to identify more adaptive emotions? And again, this is going to work, with bright, insightful clients. It's going to be harder with people with limited emotional awareness. And so, again, a 5-minute demonstration, a 6-minute demonstration is somewhat artificial. And so this process of exploring other emotions may look different with other clients. I want to tell you a real example that I did this week, and I did it this week while I was preparing these slides and revising this. So this was what was on my mind. I have a client who has anxiety and panic, And but one of the ways she deals with her anxiety is that she binge eats. She eats to self-soothe. So we drew on my dry erase board kind of she feels anxious, she binges, and then she feels ashamed, and then is self-critical, and how the binging is a short-term benefit of making her feel good in the short run, but then she feels ashamed of it again. And so I talked about this, the shame is like, shame isn't helpful right now, because it makes your best way of dealing with shame is by self-soothing with food again. And so I said it pretty openly, like, are there other emotions that would be more helpful? And she didn't say, and I said, do you feel sad? Do you feel afraid? And so we talked about feeling sad about this pattern and feeling afraid that this pattern will never stop, and that. And so we tried to do that. So that's an example, of this actively exploring other emotions and seeing if they might feel better. So Maria said, sometimes we need to make psychoeducation. They don't know how to name emotions. They mix up everything. Definitely. And sometimes, I have a emotions, a list of 9 core emotions that I sometimes use. So any more questions or comments about kind of this idea of transformation, of exploration and transformation, or exploration and discovery?
Jeff, a question for you here. Especially with emotions and what you're trying to do you talk with patients ahead of time as to like what this model ends up looking like a session 0, if you would, to kind of meta communicate what you're trying to do with the model?
Yeah, so I often say real explicitly, when I'm working with anxiety, when I'm working with depression, I like to look at the interaction of thoughts, feelings, and actions. And so so often in the second half of the first session, I'll do a multidimensional survey. We'll draw it on the dry erase board, and then I'll say we're going to collect some more data to see if the pattern that we'd identified today is typical or if there's variations on that. So yeah, I talk about thoughts, actions, and feelings as very clearly with the clients. I draw it on the dry erase board. Sometimes, I'll give it to them as a worksheet, like we distributed a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, I try and talk about thoughts, actions, and feelings pretty explicitly. And I work with college students, so it's easy to do that. If you're working with other populations that aren't as insightful or intellectual, it may be harder to do that.
Thanks.
I also have a question. Obviously, this is a 5-minute intervention, right? In a actual session, would you spend more time allowing the client to kind of dwell with the feeling and the emotion and actually be in that emotional space?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I agree with emotion-focused therapy. If we can activate the emotions, we're more likely to be able to transform them. So that was one of the points that I was going to make with this client, the binge eating client. It was interesting sitting with her and seeing her facial expressions that looked like shame, and then saying, just talking about sadness and fear as possible alternative emotions, and her facial expression changed. She looked sad and she looked a little bit afraid, but and that's a subtle difference between shame and sadness, because shame is one of those emotions that we are socialized to hide. But I did feel an affective shift in just suggesting that. And so that was one of the points I was going to make. And I don't know if I don't think we transformed her emotions. I think that we were exploring and discovering alternative emotions. So I'm intrigued by Amy's idea of calling this guided emotional discovery, because I think that, and sometimes there is that transformation and sometimes they're not. And, but yeah, if with more time, I want them to feel that, so definitely with Eileen, if I weren't trying to do a less than 7-minute demo, it would have been good to talk about that sadness and elicit that and pay attention to the bodily cues for that and so forth. So Karunikar said, is awareness not enough to heal? Will meta-emotional inquiry help the client overwhelmed by emotions? That's a good question. I don't know how to answer that one. Rachel says, it sounds like you're doing good functional analysis. Is the reason you're not calling it that? Is that too jargony? I think it's the same thing. Yeah, but I'm happy to talk to you, Rachel, about how this is. I mean, functional analysis, and I comes out of, yeah, maybe I'm doing functional analysis. Sure. We can talk more about whether I should call it that or not. But yeah, I'm doing, this is a form of functional analysis, seeing which of these are helpful and which aren't.
I'm also thinking in your chapter, you at one point you mentioned Genlin, with his focusing on emotions,
yes.
and which, with the transformation that happens, it seems like you were doing like half the work. Like the client would dwell with the feeling, and then you would lead them on to a more adaptive emotion.
Yes, and I, Genlin will be mentioned in a few slides using focusing as a advanced technique, but I often do a mini version of focusing, just saying, where do you feel that in your body? And most people feel it either in their gut, their chest, or their throat. So yeah, doing focusing in a small version or in a more explicit version is definitely something where we can look at the interaction between emotions and bodily sensations. Okay, I ignored a question a few minutes ago. I'm going to go back to Celio's question because I wanted to finish the demonstrations. Okay, Celio said, EFT is awesome. And like we were talking about emotions, what do you think about the work with positive emotions on positive psychology? Do you have been integrated in some way well-being science in your work? I haven't done that work yet. So I have a positive impression of positive psychology, and certainly I would be happy to work with any of you to integrate some of those concepts into this. So, if you have some ideas about that, please if you send an email to TUP dates talking about those ideas, then everybody in the group will be able to respond to that. So I'm teaching you about the EFT stuff today as a foundation because it parallels the adaptive, maladaptive emotion, parallels the functional, dysfunctional thoughts, and the effective, ineffective actions. That's why I'm starting with these three models, because of the parallel nature. And then that's the basis. And then we're going to move into more complexity. So I encourage any of you to incorporate any of these ideas into your own personal unified framework. But I'm trying to teach a place to start where these theories are parallel. Does that answer your question, Celia? Okay, so let's go. I'm gonna, okay, I answered. Okay, so I'm gonna whip through the rest of the slides because we only have about 10 more minutes. Okay, so far what we've been talking about for the last 20 or 30 minutes with the demonstrations is kind of change or transformation. I also want to acknowledge that there are some emotions that should be transformed, or others that should be accepted. So there's a process of exploration where you can identify specific emotions, but then see which ones need to be changed and which ones need to be accepted. So when a emotion is maladaptive, it may be helpful to engage in that transformation process, or the hold on, I'm just writing something down that I want to remember later. So sorry about that. Some emotions are maladaptive and need to be changed. And so that's certainly a part of the process. But there are going to be other emotions that are adaptive emotions, but may be difficult to feel. So feeling sadness after a loss is difficult, but may be important. Feeling anger at someone who's mistreating you may be important, even though it's difficult. So in EFT, it talks about the adaptive value of emotions. Acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT has a much more explicit focus on acceptance. And they define acceptance as remaining open and receptive to internal experiences that may be distressing. So part of it will be sitting with those emotions, particularly if they're adaptive, particularly if, even though they're difficult. So I've got some examples here of identifying maladaptive emotions that may need to be transformed and difficult adaptive emotions that may be processed and accepted. So if someone who's in the coming out process is feeling shame and self-hatred, I'm going to try and help them change those. But if someone coming out is angry at their father for rejecting them, I'm going to help them accept that anger, even though it may be difficult. If someone feels grief, I'm not going to help. I don't want to reinforce hopelessness, but I will help them process grief and move forward. If someone is dealing with an addiction, I may not reinforce or support shame, but I may help them process adaptive guilt in the form of regret and remorse. I regret the mistakes I made when I was using meth. I feel remorse about hurting my family. For after a job interview, you may be angry at those bastards who didn't accept you. It may be more adaptive to feel disappointed. So for this one, for this idea of change and acceptance, I want you to spend some time thinking about your own life experience or your clients, and when there are maladaptive emotions that may be transformed, and difficult adaptive emotions that may be processed and accepted. So please take some time after we're done to think about your own life and which emotions need to be changed and which need to be accepted. And so on the worksheet, it'll ask you how much on the worksheet, it'll ask you how much in your work with clients do you focus on emotional acceptance or emotional transformation. So I want to go back to EFT. In Leslie Greenberg's book, which now in the second edition, I quoted the first editions. I haven't bought the second edition, so I don't know how much has been changed. But when we're looking at difficult emotions, Greenberg suggests 7 different ways to facilitate access to more adaptive emotions. So shifting your attention from one emotion to another, accessing needs and goals. So what did you need at that time is a good way to get to adaptive emotions. Positive imagery, expressive enactment of an emotion, remembering another emotion, talking about an emotion, and then expressing an emotion on the client's behalf. So the expressing emotion is that, self-disclosure, that interpersonal process of saying, when I heard this story, I felt sad, or I know that you're laughing about this, but boy, I felt really hurt when that happened to you. So again, if we want to do more in-depth training on experiential psychotherapy, we can talk about these in more detail. In my book, in the chapter that I shared with you at the beginning of the week, my catalog of key strategies was experiential and humanistic techniques. So some of these are from EFT. Some of them are classic humanistic interventions, like looking at self-actualization and positive regard and authenticity. There's some of the Gestalt interventions about integrating parts of self and focusing attention and here now awareness. There's some of those existential ideas about freedom and responsibility and existential limitations. In terms of advanced experiential interventions, these are 4 that are highlighted in the book Learning Emotion Focused Therapy by Elliott, Watson, Goldman, and Greenberg. So experiential focusing is an intervention developed by Eugene Genland. Reprocessing problematic experiences is a procedure developed by Laura Rice. Two-chair dialogues and empty chair experiments are both classic Gestalt experiments that Fritz Perls wrote about. So if this is an area where you need to expand your repertoire, these are some of the directions you can go. And we as a training group can help you do that if that's something you'd like more training in. So I've covered a lot of ground, a little, starting from the simple to a broader repertoire. Are there other experiential strategies that are a regular part of your repertoire? Is there anybody who would like to highlight some of the good experiential work they do that we haven't highlighted? So Amy said, I really like the point here that after working with maladaptive emotions, you may not end up with a pleasant emotion, and then acceptance can play a profound role. Thank you, I agree. Rachel said, if you do more in-depth emotions training, can we talk about when patients describe an aversive and primary experience of emptiness? Ooh, yes. But that, yeah, I'm working with a client right now who has lack of, who feels kind of numb and not aware. And so emptiness or numbness or emotional awareness, I think those are good things to explore. Anybody want to turn on their microphone and talk about other experiential strategies that you use that we haven't highlighted or mentioned here today?
Similar to the some of the Gestalt techniques you mentioned, I will sometimes have people imagine a past event that was really painful to them and have them maybe re-script it and talk through it first in a bad way and then in with a more positive outcome.
Yeah, so dealing with some of those painful feelings, but then imagining it a different way. And so that definitely gets into that needs and wants. What did you need in that situation? I like that, Jim. Thank you.
I don't know how well it would fit in here, but mentioning body language and tone of voice to the patient, because there's obviously something there that we're picking up on, and then ask the person to explore it. So I guess it's Gestalt. Maybe I've seen Bugenthal also do the same sort of thing. So using that as a tool to get into the emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you're right. Gestalt has done a lot of that, but I also think that that's just good common factors. Your facial expression changed. What's going on? So Valentine said there may be cultural issues in expression of emotion in psychotherapy. African patients may not express emotions freely. Absolutely. This needs to be done in a cultural context. And, also what I do in psychotherapy may not be, the way we express emotions in psychotherapy may not be good with other people. So when I do empty chair work, I always say, this is the unedited version. May not be appropriate for you to share with others. We'll talk. This is for the purpose of expression and catharsis and exploration. We'll talk later about how you actually might want to say this to someone. So let me go ahead and just hit the last few slides. So on the worksheet, I hope you have some time in the next few days to do a practice of an experiential conceptualization where you list, and you can do this for yourself or for a client, either one, where you list at least 2 emotions related to the same situation, identify whether they're primary, second, or instrumental, and then figure out which of these might be adaptive or maladaptive. So I hope you give it a chance to practice that on your own. These are a couple of books that I recommend by Greenberg and some of his colleagues. Here's the reference for my book.
We're not seeing the slides.
Oh, you were right. I failed. Thank you. Okay. So here are a couple books I recommend: Emotion Focused Therapy by Leslie Greenberg and Learning Emotion Focused Therapy by Elliott Watson, Goldman, and Greenberg. The Learning Emotion Focused Therapy has pretty in-depth descriptions of two-chair work, empty chair, focusing, and evocative reprocessing. So I'm going to be doing some discussion groups in between level 1 and level 2, so people can talk about their practice of this, and those will be on June 24th and July 8th. And if you want more experiential training, I'm happy to do that. Ed and I were talking early in the week by email, and he said that one of the barriers is going to be that most people trained now have more background in cognitive behavioral and less in emotion focus. So if you want more experiential training, just let me know, and I'll try and set up something like that in the fall. And any final words of wisdom before we wrap up today? Okay, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your good questions. Thank you for thinking about psychotherapy in a complex way. I appreciate your time and attention. I wish we were in person so I could see your faces. This is more socially rewarding than writing a book, but less socially rewarding than hanging out in the same room together. So I hope I get to meet some of y'all in person in the future. Thanks a lot. And next week, we'll be talking about behavioral focus in unified psychotherapy. Thanks, everybody.